Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for electronic music techniques. Today we're going to be diving into more tools available to us within Studio One, particularly dealing with audio. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So here I have the welcome screen from Studio One, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new song for this demonstration. So let's go ahead and make a new song. I'm going to choose from an empty song and create everything from scratch. I'm going to go ahead and give it a title. Let's call it MUS 2240 Audio. I'm going to go ahead and just save this to my desktop for today for convenience sake. Sample rate, I'm going to go ahead and do 48K. This was talked about in the video you should have just watched, so this number should make a little more sense than it may have before. And I'm going to go ahead and do a resolution of 24-bit. For what it's worth, I often work at 48K and 24-bit because most of the work that I send out doesn't need to be at a higher sample rate or higher bit depth. But if you do have a particular client or a particular reason to do so, you could of course choose higher sample rates. I'm going to go ahead and select OK to create this project, and we're going to spend some time talking about a few things in Studio One that we did not talk about before. So the very first thing I'm going to do is go to my desktop where I saved this, and I also have a little audio sample. I'm going to go ahead and create some audio for us in Studio One just to demonstrate a number of things. So I'm going to take this little funky electronic sample, and I can just go ahead and drag it and drop it right in to Studio One. And when I do that, it's going to show me the waveform. It's going to create an audio track for me. I can resize this track so I can see more of the waveform if I would like, which in this case I do want to see it a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit play, which you'll notice the transport controls are down here. But by default, this is mapped to your spacebar key. So I'm going to go ahead and hit spacebar to hear this audio. I'll go ahead and stop there because it continues and it sounds quite similar. So this is kind of a funky French electronic sample from a cool sample library available from an experimental studio over in France called GRM. So it's a pretty cool little sound. Let's hear just a few more seconds of it one more time. Cool, so that's a real toe tapper. So what I'd like to do is show you a few tools, particularly that are useful for working with audio in Studio One. So the best place to start, and I had mentioned this in a previous video, are these tools at the top of the screen. Now we don't need to go over every one of them just now. I want to go over a few of the most important ones and how to get your workflow very quick with these tools. So you'll notice by default, I have what is called their multi-tool selected. And when I have this selected, that's actually by collecting this little sort of parenthesis icon over here. I can select individual tools, but when I have this little multi-tool selected by selecting this parenthesis-like icon, you'll notice that I have this little selector tool, which they simply call the arrow tool selected. I also have what they call the range tool selected, and you'll also notice that I have this little blue line under what they call the split tool. Sometimes that's called the knife tool or the blade or the cut tool, depending on the piece of software, but it cuts regions of audio or video into different pieces. So I tend to keep my workflow in Studio One selected to this tool by default. I'm going to go ahead and show you why. When you have this range tool selected and the arrow tool selected via this little multi-tool, again, I could select them individually, but I like to select right here and have multiple of them selected at once. I want you to notice how, and I'm going to make the waveform bigger, notice how my mouse looks different depending on which portion of the audio region it is hovering over. If it is above the middle line, you'll notice that I get this little cross icon, which means I am selecting the range tool. If I move it to the lower half of the screen, you'll notice that I get this mouse icon, which means the arrow tool. This is really useful when you want to do things quickly because it means that I can click in the lower half of the audio and I can move the audio around. I can drag it left and right, or as I did a second ago, I could drag it to another track back and forth. I can select and move things around with the arrow tool, okay? It's a great tool. That's what you do. You click things, you grab them, you move them, you select things, you highlight things. That's sort of what this tool is for. When I move the tool upward, you'll notice I get the range tool. And by the way, I'm just left clicking. I'm not doing anything with the right click tool. That's a whole different option. I'm just using the left click. So with the same button in my mouse where I can use the arrow tool to move stuff, I can also just left click in the upper portion of the audio to select some portion of that audio. This is really great. I can select a range of that audio without actually having to switch tools. Now that I have this range selected, I could do a couple of things with it, but one of the best examples that I can show you is I could move the mouse back again to the lower half so that it's the arrow tool, and I can just click and I can literally move that section of audio away, or I could drag that section of audio to a new track. And you'll notice that suddenly now I have 2 audio tracks, and I just went ahead and surgically removed that portion of the track. And I didn't have to select a different tool or use a different key command or hold anything down. I was able to do that just really quickly. So this is a tool that I found some people, they kind of want to turn it off when they first try using Studio One, and other digital audio workstations like Logic and Pro Tools have a similar kind of multi-tool like property to them. I recommend you try to leave these on and that you really get used to working with them, because it can really speed up your workflow, especially when working with audio files and samples and that sort of thing. So one thing that's really handy that I can do is I can select on my arrow tool. You'll notice I have this little drop down icon right here. I can left click that. And what this does is lets me select my alternative tool. Now, if you're on a Mac, that's going to say command, not control. I'm on a PC, so it says control, but keep in mind it's going to work the same way. I'm going to select, for example, the split tool, because I think that's a really handy tool to be able to have without needing to switch which tool you have selected. It's sort of it's in the wings. It's waiting for you to use it. So it doesn't show when I move my mouse to different positions. It appears when I hit Control on my keyboard. So as long as I hold down Control, I can now cut this audio at any point, and then I can break it into different sections. And you'll notice I didn't have to switch back to any other tool. This was still selected for me, and I'm able to move audio around, cut things, rearrange things. I have basically 3 tools selected at any given moment. If you find that your workflow is a little better to have something other than the split tool selected, maybe the bend tool or the listen tool, which we will talk about in the future, or the paint tool, which can come in handy when we start talking about automation, you may want to select a different alternative tool. I will say quite often I have the split tool selected, and this is how Studio One loads by default, by the way. It will have the arrow tool as your primary option, with the range tool selected as the other option within the track, depending on where you are, and we'll have the split tool as your alternative tool. So being aware of these tools and how they generally operate on these regions of audio is really, really useful. I'm just going to hit undo a few times and undo those cuts and just get back to this single piece of audio. Let's make sure it still sounds like it did before. All right, so now that we have an actual audio region here and that we can play it and that we can manipulate it with some of these tools, let's refresh ourselves on these 3 buttons down in the lower right-hand corner, which are tremendously important for us. Let's go ahead and select Mix, because this brings up our mixer. I can resize this mixer in case I want to have it take up more room or less room. And as a reminder from what I discussed before, I can also change whether it is a small or large or sort of side by side. As a reminder, if I select this small versus large option, you'll notice that my option for inserts and sends, which we will talk about in the future, lives above the track. When I shrink it down here, you'll notice they sort of go away, but I can click this little button and have them side by side. So I have different means of viewing this. I tend to leave it on this default view because it works well on my screen. But most things in Studio One, you can click on the edges of, and you can resize and you can reshape the window in a way that works really well for you. So I could have the overall mixer get bigger. I can again sort of shrink things and make things more compact as much as I would like to do so. So within this audio track, you'll notice that I have some similar controls up here that I also have down here. So one of the most fundamental ones that I have is simply the audio, the volume. So I can hit play, and I could turn that audio down. Now you'll notice that this is demonstrating what I had talked about in the most recent lecture, which is that this ranges from -infinity, when I go all the way down, all the way up to 0 dB relative to full scale. You'll notice I can click and enter values if I want, so I could type in -5 and hit enter, or I could drag this to whatever value I want. Sometimes it's easy just to go ahead and type 0 back in. I have a couple other options that are useful to show within this track, so I can hit play, and I could hit mute, in which case the audio simply stops playing. I could also hit solo. In this case, we're not going to hear a difference, because this is the only track in my interface. So let's go ahead and do something. Let's do what I did before, but instead of just clicking and dragging this down to a different track, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to undo that. I'm going to unsolo this track, and I'm going to do a wonderful little shortcut that's worth knowing in just about any artistic piece of software. A lot of graphic softwares do this, a lot of video editors, and a lot of digital audio workstations. If I hold down Alt on my keyboard and then click and drag the file and then let go and then finally lift up Alt, I can just make little carbon copies of stuff without having to hit edit, copy, edit, paste. Those functions will work. You'll notice that I can, I could zoom out a little. By the way, you can zoom out on your vertical or horizontal axes whenever you would like. But I'm going to go ahead and zoom out a little bit on the X axis, and I could select, highlight this little audio region. I could hit edit, I could hit copy, and then I could move my playhead over here and I could hit edit, paste. Or if I wanted to do that a little more quickly, I could select it, hit Control C on Windows or Command C on a Mac and hit Control C, and then I can move the playhead and I could hit Control V and paste it a little more quickly. It's going to paste in whichever audio track I have selected. So if I were to select this track, move over here, and then hit Control V, it's going to paste it over there. But again, just as a reminder, a much quicker option, I'm just hitting undo a few times, is to hold down Alt. Hold down the whole time. So I'm holding Alt, I click, I drag, I move this other instance, I let go with the mouse, and then I let go of Alt, and I've created two instances. So now that I have two of these tracks right here, I can now see that I have two audio tracks in the mixer. I can hit play. You'll notice that it's louder and that I actually clip over here because this is my master track where every track in my mix sums and they all get mixed here. I created two tracks that were exactly the same and it caused some issues. I went above that theoretical maximum. But now that I have two of them, I could solo one, so I only hear one of them, or I could solo both. And then this is great. So I could mute the others. I could solo one. One thing that could be really useful to know, though, is that sometimes you have a bunch of tracks and you muted some, you soloed others, and you kind of lose track of where you're clicking what, where, when, and why. So just as a reminder, you can also click these buttons over here. These are these global mute and global solo. So if I have anything soloed and I click this, it goes away. If I have anything muted, it goes away for all tracks. So if you have like 30 tracks muted and 7 soloed and you don't want to individually click them down here in the mixer with lots of tracks, remember these global buttons. They are tremendously helpful. Let's also return very quickly to the browser, which is open by default, but if it's not open for you, you can click the Browse button in the bottom right-hand corner. This is my home screen, and each one of these tabs shown in the home screen also exists across the top of the screen, so I think it's a little bit redundant. We're going to spend most of our time for now in the Instruments tab. Now, as a reminder, I'm going to have a few different options here, namely native instruments, because I have those installed on my computer, but you should see this category called Presonus, whether you're running Studio One or Studio One Artist, and you should also see these 5 instruments available to you. You may not have all the same options underneath if you sort of click the little drop-down menu. And by the way, I will say there's also this little icon option for thumbnails versus a list, or however you want to view these kinds of things. I kind of like seeing it as little just as text. I don't like seeing these kind of big bubbly images, but for the time being, because they're visually iconographic, let's go ahead and leave them open. So just as a reminder, this is where the browser lives, and it lets you do some cool things like drag and drop stuff. So let's go ahead and drag an instance of this MyTi synthesizer into Studio One. We're not going to do much with the MyTi synthesizer yet. I'll play a couple notes. Okay, so, and I clipped. I'm a terrible audio human. I just want to point out a couple of things. You'll notice that once again, I automatically have a new track because Studio One works on this kind of drag and drop option very well. It also creates a new track in the mixer for me, and you'll notice that it now lists an instrument because I have a track with an instrument. So this is what we would call an instrument track. You'll actually notice this is one of my favorite things. Here are these little kind of waveform looking icons on these audio tracks. Over here we have this little piano symbol to let us know that it is an instrument track and not an audio track. And as we later create buses and sends and effects tracks and other things, we'll actually see a few other icons that are available for us, but it lets us at a glance sort of see what is going on with what type of track we are dealing with. Another thing to remember, any track I have selected, either up here or down in the mixer, wherever I want to select it. Let's go ahead and hide the mixer. So let's say I don't want to necessarily have the mixer taking up such a large part of my screen, but I want to get some information about this track. As a reminder, you can select F4 on your keyboard or hit I for inspector. And this sort of brings up a nice little mixer type view of this track. So if I select the mixer, you'll notice that a lot of the information that is shown in this channel strip right here, and some of which is shown right here, I get kind of a complete picture of a lot of the information on this track. A delay, whether it's doing some kind of tempo, if it's doing any time stretching. I can also see effects that I've added, inserts, sends. I can also mute and solo the track. I can add macros. I can decide whether this track is armed for recording, as we'll talk about in the future, whether I'm monitoring that track, so I'm hearing it in my headphones, and I can adjust the channel mode. Just as I can do down here, I can also pan the track left and right. So if I wanted to hear just this track, let's go ahead and solo it and hear it only out of my left channel. I can also pan that across, center, and move it all the way over to the right, depending on how I want to mix that track and where I want it to live in my stereo field. And that gives us just the things I've gone over between the inspector, the browser, the editor, and these tools up top. We already have quite a bit of things that we can do with this audio. So for example, if I wanted to just take my little blade tool, my split tool, as a reminder, I can just hit Control, and I can sort of cut this up, and then I could have my arrow tool selected by default, and I can move these things around. I can overlap them. I could do some interesting and creative things already, combine this with copying and pasting, and I could have some interesting sound design capabilities with really just some of these surface level tools without having to explore any of the other more powerful options beneath the hood. So these tools and these windows and this general interface are things that you're going to want to get familiar with and get practiced with. So practicing keyboard shortcuts is tremendously useful. Spending some time exploring these buttons, exploring these different windows, and seeing what things do is going to help you out a lot. As is the case in a lot of pieces of software, Studio One is also great. If you hover your mouse over something, it'll often show you what it does. So this tells me that this is going to solo something. If I hover my mouse over here, it's going to tell me that I can open the marker track. Or if I hover it here, it tells me it's going to show automation. Some of these are future topics, but keep in mind that many of them are readily accessible and the information is presented to you. So I'm going to go ahead and reopen my mix window. I'm going to get rid of all my soloing, and I'm going to go ahead and just hide this inspector track because I don't need it for the time being. A couple other things on this main window to look at are down at the bottom of the screen. So we have a lot of information that's available to us. Not all of it is super relevant at the moment, but a couple of things that are useful. One, we have a time where we can see where in the project. Let's go ahead and just mute that. We can see where we are in the project in terms of seconds, milliseconds, minutes, hours, etc. We can see how long I can record with my hard drive space. Right now, you can see I could record quite a bit of audio. We could see where we are in terms of bars and beats in case we are doing a project where we want to line up with this grid of musical measures that happens to be in 4/4 time. As we can see over here, this is our time signature. We can also adjust our tempo. We can just click and drag that number up and down and it changes this grid. Again, this is a topic in detail for the future, so don't worry if this is going a little quick. I just want to show what some of these options are. We have a metronome that can play when we are recording. We could play when we are listening. We could also click this little wrench and change the sound of our metronome to different sounds, different accents, different beats. We could set a pre-roll option so that we hear the metronome before we start recording. And once we start working with MIDI data and some synthesis, this will come in even more handy. One other thing that I think is really useful down here, I mean, in addition to these play controls where we can hit play and stop and record, there's also this little loop active tool. Now, right now, it doesn't really show us anything because we don't have any portion looped. But if I move my mouse up to this little corner, you can actually see that there's this little kind of triangle icon. If I click and drag that out, this is what lets me turn on my loop tool. And if I turn this on, you'll notice it highlights it blue. And when I play something within this looped range, I'll make it really short. I hit play, and you'll notice what happens. Oh, you know what? I'm going to unmute it so you can hear it. Okay, so when this loop tool is on, the loop active section, and you've drawn this loop, and you can sort of select on either end, and you can move this thing around, you can draw with a pencil depending on where you put the mouse. This is great, not so much for creating loop-based music, but for looping a single section of your track and listening to it over and over again. I can also click and drag right on this little timeline up here if I want to zoom in or out on the horizontal axis just as well, which is a quick way to zoom in and out. As a reminder, I can also increase and decrease the size of all of my tracks at once, but I can also individually increase the size of one track while others are small in case I want to really save screen real estate for just what I'm working on. I also have this option to snap them all to the same size at once if I want to bring things back to normal. I tend to work with things in this kind of medium or large section when I only have a few tracks running at a time. So one of the other really great tools that we can select, and this is true when we are working with MIDI or when we are working with audio, and I'm just going to hit undo quite a few times. I'm going to hit undo a lot of times until this audio file is sort of back to one single entity. I'm going to hit redo. I'm going to just get rid of these tracks because I don't need them for the time being. And anytime you want to get rid of a track, I can click it, right click, and then I can select remove track. I can also duplicate that track or duplicate track complete. Duplicating the track will duplicate the track and like an instrument that might live on it. If you duplicate the track and do the complete option, it will duplicate all the information like the audio and MIDI files, and we will return to that in the future. I'll remove that track and I'll just go ahead and remove this track. I can also remove this track and instrument versus just the track, because as a reminder, this track has this MyTie instrument. So later, as when we talk about MIDI, if you want to have one instrument feeding multiple tracks, you may want to simply remove a track, but in this case, I want to remove the track and the instrument. So one of the windows that we haven't talked a whole lot yet about is this edit window down here. I can get there in a couple of ways. I could select this audio file and I could click edit. I'm going to close this just to demonstrate one other option. I can unselect it. For me, the quickest way with an audio region, or as we will see in the future, a MIDI region, I can double click and it automatically opens up this audio editor. So this is my editor. We will edit audio files and MIDI down here, and we can do a few things that are just a little quicker and easier when we are in this edit window. So you'll notice, first of all, we have a very similar set of tools, and my mouse is going to behave differently in this portion of the program versus down here in the dedicated editor. We have options to quantize, which we will discuss when we start creating MIDI. We have a similar set of tools to what we have seen over at the top of the piece of software in the past. So for example, I could select my little split tool and I could split this up, and you'll notice if I split things down here, it does so over here. So the thing that I really want to talk about is this action button. So just make sure that you have your audio file selected, or else this action button won't have all of these options. You'll notice if I click away and then select action, I lose most of them. They're grayed out. I still want to have this audio file selected. And when I select action, I have some pretty cool options here. So for example, I could reverse this audio and we could hear it backwards. And again, it reflects in real time up here, and I can hit play. Now, of course, this is kind of a funky electronic sample, so the fact that it's backwards isn't necessarily readily apparent to our ears, but we can see visually that it has happened. I can also do a few other things like normalize, and if you don't know what normalizing is, we can return to that in the future, but what it's going to do is look for the single highest peak in the track, the loudest moment, and it's going to bring that peak all the way up to this theoretical 0 dB value all the way up here, and then everything else, it's just going to scale up accordingly. So it just takes the overall amplitude of our track and increases it so that the max option is right at 0. So you can see my track gets a little bit louder. Some other options that won't be super useful in this exact context, but we could do this option called strip silence. And you'll notice it gets rid of some stuff. And what this does is if Studio One sees that the audio is pretty quiet in that instant, it's just going to get rid of that audio. This is really great when you're recording things like narration or voiceovers, or even like this lecture that I'm doing right now. I can use that strip silence feature, and then in between my words, maybe just when I'm breathing, it's going to get rid of a lot of excess audio that I might not want to work with. So I can do some stuff to audio up here, but I have a greater set of options when I am down in this window. I can also right click and I can get a lot of these options as well, such as strip silence, normalize audio. You'll notice I have recent items. I also have audio options here where I can get more of them so that they are available. Interestingly enough, I can right click up here and get a lot of these. So quite often I don't need to work in this edit window for audio files because most of them can be accessed via a right click, not command or control click, but an actual right click. So you'll notice that I could reverse the audio by doing so up here. So while the edit window is useful and powerful, I will say most of my audio editing work is done simply up here in this mix window or this edit window, and I can right click and get a lot of these. I could duplicate, I could hit undo. I'm hitting Control Z, it's Command Z on Mac for that. Again, I could reverse right there, strip silence. I could normalize, but it's already normalized. I could edit with Melodyne. That's not available in Studio One Artist, but if you need to do some pitch correcting, Melodyne, you get a version of it with the full version of Studio One. I can also do a few general operations for these audio events, so I could mute that event, whatever region I have selected. I'm going to undo that strip silence, so it's one big region again. I have a few other options. I can merge two audio tracks so that they are together. I can remove gaps. We'll explore some of these as we explore more audio options, but I want you to know that they are there. Again, audio options here. Studio One, like many complex pieces of software, has more than one way of doing the same thing because they like to make these tools accessible. So try not to feel overwhelmed if you see the same tool in multiple places. They are going to do the same thing. So the last thing that I want to discuss with you today is one of the software instruments that comes with Studio One called Sample 1XT. I'm going to go ahead and just remove this track because I no longer need it. And I'm going to go to Browse. And as I did before, I'm under Instruments, Presonus, and you'll notice I have these different options. We will look at all of these before the class is completed, but I'm going to go ahead and start with sample 1. And I can, as I've done before, I can click and drag to bring sample 1 into my project, and it creates an instance of it, and it actually just opens the window right away for me. Fun little hidden feature. You can click this little Presonus logo and change the color if you want. I usually use this blue one or this sort of more teal one, because teal is, in addition to being my favorite color, it is objectively the best color. So with that in mind, what is sample 1? Well, sample 1 is a sample editor. And by the way, I want to make sure that I make a distinction. When I say a sample editor, I don't mean a single audio sample, as we are talking about at this portion of our course as well, where we talk about like 44,100 audio samples per second. In this case, a sample means sort of like a short prepared audio file. Like when we talk about, popular songs that sample another artist, they use some portion of their song, they do something to it, they loop it, they change the key, they change the pitch, they change the rhythm, they maybe put it into a sequence or a beat. That's what I'm talking about. This is a tool designed for doing some cool audio sampling, where you could take a short audio file and you can do interesting things to it. You can get audio into sample 1 in a number of ways. The easiest way perhaps is to, as I did before, I can take an audio file and I can just drag it in as long as I'm in this wave tab right here. So I can click and drag this in, and you'll notice that I now have this audio file. So how do I play it? Well, you can either click notes on this keyboard, or if you have a keyboard, like a MIDI keyboard of your own connected to your computer, you can also play that. And I can hit, now I'm gonna hit C3, because you'll notice there's this little white line on C3, and that means that this is the key that is assigned to the default playback of this sample. Wherever this little white line is, that means I will play back this sample exactly as it sounds. So if I click this key and hold it down, you'll notice that I get the audio file as we've heard it before. I do happen to have a MIDI keyboard in front of me, so I can also physically press a key. You'll notice that this key still shows as if it's being pressed, even though I am not clicking it. Now, you may not have a MIDI keyboard, and you may not want to click around with the mouse, especially because, as you'll notice, that if I hit record and then I press these keys, it unfortunately doesn't record them. We don't get little MIDI notes, as we will talk about in the future. I get nothing from this. So one other way to approach playing this sampler is to make sure you go under Studio One, Options. And again, we have these tabs up top that we explored a little before. We want to talk about the external devices tab. Now I'm going to remove this one because this is what I want to create. I want to show you how to add it. I want to add a keyboard to control this device that is based on nothing other than my computer keyboard. You'll notice I have my Complete Control S keyboard for playing notes. I have my Complete Control DAW because this keyboard has buttons on it that lets it control certain parameters of it. I also have my Atom drum pad, but it's not connected, so it's giving me an error. But I'm going to go ahead and click Add, and I want to add a new keyboard. Now, I could select new keyboard or new instrument or new control surface, or if I own a keyboard, like let's say I have an Akai keyboard, I could select any of these models that are available, and Studio One will recognize these. So we have a lot of options by a lot of the most popular brands. So we could add like a Yamaha keyboard, a number of ones by Korg, maybe something by Evolution. In this case, though, we actually want to go down to Presonus because they actually have a QWERTY keyboard built in. That's the name of your typing keyboard that is on your computer. And I can select OK. And you'll notice that I now have this QWERTY keyboard option, and I can select OK. So if I want this thing to be controlled via the QWERTY keyboard, I have to do a couple of things. One, I have to select this little down arrow and select QWERTY keyboard. But if I just start hitting keys on my keyboard right now, Studio One is going to recognize those keys as other keyboard shortcuts that control things for the whole piece of software. So I also have to hit this little gear button to bring this down, and then under Control, I can hit this option, and here I can view my QWERTY keyboard, and it's actually going to bring that little keyboard up. In this case, it was hiding behind that window, so I'm going to bring this around. You can see my other control surfaces here as well. If it's not showing up when you immediately click this little button, make sure that you just check behind your sample one window. And now I have this little keyboard that, as long as this is the thing that I have selected, I can hit the letter Q on my keyboard, or W, E, R, T, and you can hear we're getting a pitch change, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is a great way for you to be able to play your keyboard of your computer like a little musical instrument within Sample One. I mentioned that because now if I hit record, you can see it's recording the data of the notes I press. So even if you don't have a MIDI keyboard and you want to do some cool MIDI performance or cool sample performance, you have this QWERTY keyboard option built in. So I encourage you to turn this on if that's something you would like to do. Sometimes it's nice to hit this little pin button, which is going to keep this editor open no matter what you do, in case you don't want to accidentally have this window get closed or lost. I'm going to leave it open for the time being. So now I have an audio file in sample 1. I have the ability to play it with my keyboard. Or in my case, I could play it with a physical keyboard as well. I could also click buttons with the mouse, but as a reminder, it won't actually capture that data, so it only helps you audition things. Okay, so what's actually happening here? Let's talk about this. If I play C3, I mentioned we will hear the audio file as intended. Sample 1 by default takes a sample or an audio file that you drag into this window and maps it across all the keys of the keyboard to increase in pitch as you go up and decrease in pitch as we go down. And it does this largely through playing the file more quickly or more slowly. So watch, if I play C3, notice how quickly that blue line is moving across the sample. Let's play C up an octave and look at the pace of that blue line. So I went up an octave and it's playing it twice as fast. I could also go down an octave. As we learned in our recent lecture, digital audio is nothing but really a table of samples, 44,100 samples per second, depending on our sample rate. So rather than reading through 44,100 samples at 44,100 samples per second, we can simply increase or decrease the speed which we read through that table of values. Really, it's no different than taking a tape player and playing the tape fast or slow. If you play it slow, things get really low and silly sounding, and if you turn them up, you sound like chipmunks. So I can now play this sample sort of like a musical instrument. So we can hear that major scale. Now, I will say some of these tools we're going to talk about today, some we are going to save for future videos where we get more in-depth with this. So let's talk about a few other necessary tools to work with sample 1 to make some cool sounds. One of the best things you can do is select this little region here, and you can actually decrease which portion of the sample you are working with. We can also zoom in on this axis, and we can move these around so we don't necessarily have to have this huge, like 20-second sample. Cool, so that starts to sound a little more interesting. Okay, now I do have this loop option here so that in case I want to hold the note down, you'll notice that it just loops. I tend to kind of leave things in this off position. We'll talk about release and ping pong in the future, but right now you could make it loop with sustain. Or you could just have it as sort of like a one-off, where once it reads through the table, it is done. I can do a few other things to this audio. I can also reverse it so that it plays backward. Again, in this case, the audible result is not quite as pronounced. Notice I can also normalize so that it brings the audio up to its maximum potential amplitude based off its highest peak. It just shifts everything up accordingly. So it gets a little bit lower. You'll notice I talked earlier about how this C3 is like my root note where it plays the sample as the sample originally is intended to sound. But please note that you can change that if you want with this value right here, and I could change that to C2. And now the little white line moves down here, and now I have to play the keyboard down an octave in order to hear that. If I want to do that over in this keyboard, you'll notice Q now plays it an octave higher. I can shift down an octave, left and right, either with the arrow keys on my computer, or I can click right here, and now Q is going to sound proper. I'm going to go ahead and just change this back to C3 because I sort of like that one a little bit more. Within the world of mapping, here is this tab up here. This is how I map which keys trigger which sound. You'll notice I have a list of samples. This is my only sample right now. We can set things up in sample 1 so that different keys on our keyboard play different sounds. We will return to this in the future, but you can map it so that different keys play different sounds, as well as how hard you strike the key can cause the sound to be different, or it can play the same sound differently based off that. I will talk about the envelopes here. So we talked about envelopes in our recent lecture. We can see we have envelopes for pitch, filter, and amplitude. Let's just talk about amplitude today. And I'm going to show you that you'll notice we have this little amplitude option down here. This correlates to this amplitude envelope here. So I could be under wave and I could still change this, and I can adjust things here, but I don't get much visual feedback. If I switch to envelopes, you'll notice that I can change things so that I change the ADSR of my sound. So let's talk about this for a second. Let's bring this back all the way down. When I go to my wave, and I've just created this little truncated file, when I hit a note, you'll notice it sort of clicks on and off because it's just on or it's off. That's because my attack and release are instantaneous. They just happen right away. The note just sort of goes on for 0 seconds, and then it turns off in 0 seconds. So I could smooth this out and make the note sound a lot more interesting and pleasing by adjusting the amplitude envelope. Because as we talked about, the amplitude envelope is your sound's amplitude journey over time. So how about we say that it takes a little while? How about that it takes 80, no, let's go pretty big. Let's say 516 milliseconds, just over half a second for the sound to activate. So when I hit a key, it should sound a lot smoother with the way the note starts, but not the way it ends. Isn't that great? Notice how it slides in a little bit? It's doing that. It's increasing its maximum amplitude over this duration. So if I bring this back down, it's going to sort of just click on again. That's super frustrating. Oh, I didn't mean to move that. Let's bring this attack up a little more. Let's bring it really far. Let's say like 764 milliseconds, so about 3/4 of a second. Cool. We could also add a decay because right now, well, sorry, we have a decay, but we actually want to have like a sustain amplitude that's maybe a little bit lower. So we could have any amount of decay time, how long it takes, and then we could have a sustain value that maybe is a little lower to create a slightly more interesting shape to this sound. Cool. Now, of course, right now, my wave is pretty short, so let's make this a little bit longer so we have a bit more time to hear these changes. Let's go to envelope, and let's also add a release. Let's make it so this thing doesn't release instantaneously. Let's take about a half a second to release, and we're going to have a much more pleasing sound. You know, that sustain is a little intense of a drop, and let's make it so that this happens a little more quickly. Cool. So this is an example of what I was talking about, how an envelope in real time can be tremendously powerful, and it can really change how a sound hits us. It really is quite different with this particular amplitude envelope being drawn and controlling the sound over time. All right, let's just show a couple other things that can be done in sample 1 today, and then we will return to more detail in the future. I'm just going to show you that there is this filter option. So if you don't know what a filter is, don't worry, we will return to that in the future. But you can see we have a cutoff frequency of 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. What a filter does is it only lets sounds through that are below that threshold. So if I suddenly turn this filter down to 677 hertz, at least based on this type of filter, only sounds 677 hertz and below will now make it through. So we should lose a lot of high frequency content, and this sound should sound a lot darker. Ooh. I mean, taking a sample that was, kind of all in your face, I think we turned in something kind of cool by lowering this. Let's make it really low, only 257 hertz. That's a very small amount of frequency content being let through. Okay, that's too dark. Let's turn this up. Let's bring it to 2,500. Okay, not bad. So that's one option. And then the only other things that I want to talk about today are these effects. We are going to return to what each of these effects do in the future. And as you'll see, what's really handy about Studio One is that we have these same effect options when we work in things like Mai Tai. Let's just stick with Effect A, and let's go ahead and turn on some delay to make this sound a little more interesting. You'll notice that we have a little low cut frequency, so we can get rid of low frequencies and trim off high frequencies if we want. We can also set the tempo of our delay, and this is in sync with my tempo down here. So this means like 1/16th note dotted or 1/16th note within my 4/4 time signature of 82. These things are talking to each other. Let's do a delay time of 1/4 note triplet. Feedback is how much of that mix goes back in. And by the way, we're going to return to delay in the future. I'm just turning it on to show you how you can make some interesting sounds. And let's add quite a bit of this delay back into the mix. And let's add even more. Let's bring that into the mix a little bit more. Let's do 50 and let's bring the feedback up. And I tell you what, let's decrease this to an 1/8 note. Kind of cool. I tell you what, let's make it a really long, like a 1/2 note. And you'll notice we can hear it going for quite a while because I have the feedback up really high. We're sending a lot of this signal back in. And then the last one, in case you want to throw this on, reverb. We have just a really basic reverb plugin. We can control a few options with the reverb. Let's just make it a really large space and bring quite a bit of it in, and let's play a note. Let's brighten it up a little. Cool, so some pretty powerful options for what we can do with a relatively straightforward sound file in Sample 1. This is a really powerful tool for lots of editing options. For example, throwing a drum sample in here, you can do some really cool stuff, and we will return to that in the future. So that is all for now. I know I went through quite a bit, and I went through it fairly quickly, so again, don't feel as though you can't watch this video again.